The 1457th Engineer Battalion traces its roots to the engineers of the 40th Infantry Division of the Army National Guard during the two World Wars. During World War I, as the National Guard made up 40% of the US Army's combat strength in Europe, the 40th Infantry Division engineers served as replacements for the astonishingly high number of casualties and deaths of engineers from other divisions. During World War II, the engineers of the 40th Infantry Division fought exclusively in the Pacific Theater. They built bridges and bravely cleared the way by torching through jungles and caves with an extensive use of flamethrowers. After World War II, the US Army underwent a massive restructuring, and in 1950, the 14th 57th Engineering Battalion was officially formed, branching off of the 40th Infantry Division.
Back down the trail.
During the Vietnam War, the use of the National Guard began to decline. The Lyndon B. Johnson administration decided to rely upon a draft rather than calling on large numbers of the National Guard as the Army did before. This was due in part to US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara wanting the National Guard to be a homeland defense force in case of a Soviet invasion. And that was the 1457th Engineering Battalion's primary mission during the 1960s. However, membership in the National Guard became a way to avoid combat service in an unpopular war. As mobilizations of the Guard fell, so did its overall performance, adherence to standards, and reputation. But this would all change. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the Department of Defense decided to test the waters with overseas use of the National Guard again. As a result, the 1457th Engineering Battalion was sent to Europe. They were the only mission-capable engineer battalion in Europe at that time, undertaking and completing construction projects valued at over $5 million. The terrorist attacks of September 11th and the War on Terror brought about a resurgence and a transformation of the National Guard. Because the draft was abolished in 1974 and the Army was needing numbers, the DoD had no choice but to deploy the National Guard to combat zones in numbers like it had never seen before. Between 2003 and 2004, the 1457th was sent to the hot zone of Iraq. Two soldiers on this deployment were Sergeant David Little and Sergeant James E. Thode. Sergeant Little recalled the uneasy feeling of the deployment, stating that the mentality of the people around him went from believing the National Guard doesn't go overseas to becoming completely numb to the sounds of mortar attacks. The engineers of the 1457th spent a year destroying thousands of munitions Saddam Hussein had buried across the country. They achieved recognition by building bridges across the Tigris River in Baghdad in contested zones. Sergeant Little could see the enemy in his sights during a perilous bridge crossing over the 14th of July bridge, as he pulled rear security for the combat engineers who pressed forward to wipe out the enemy. The 1457th Engineer Battalion were the first responders when the UN building and Red Cross headquarters were bombed by rebels. Living in tents at the Baghdad airport, the 1457th were on call 24/7. They worked diligently as snipers fired at them, and in temperatures that reached as high as 148 degrees. Their deployment was a success, and as a result, senior US Army leadership granted the 14th 57th the 118th Sapper Company. In 2008, approximately half of all US forces in Iraq were from the National Guard, and the 1457th Engineers were preparing for their return to the combat theater. In 2010, the 1457th, alongside their 118th Sappers, were deployed this time to Afghanistan and were tasked with route clearance missions and IED identification to ensure the safe mobility of coalition forces in the region. Their mission was successful, but it came at a cost, when Sergeant James E. Thode was tragically killed in an IED blast. His heroic sacrifice was not in vain, as his unit does a ruck march in his honor once a year. Like the ancient Roman soldiers of old after returning home from the deployment, Sergeant Corey Blankenstein said, "There were no paved roads before we got there. We put them all in." In 2012, the Utah Army National Guard formed the Homeland Response Force, specializing in urban search and rescue and disaster response. The 1457th was tasked with providing personnel to support this mission. The Homeland Response Force formed a partnership with the Kingdom of Morocco, training their search and rescue teams for earthquake disasters. which became very valuable as the Moroccans responded to the massive earthquakes they faced in the following decade. In 2013, the unit was called up to respond to the 2013 Colorado flooding, which caused catastrophic damage to the regions of northern Colorado. Sergeants Olson and Hope, two battle-hardened veterans that were activated, described devastation comparable to that of which they saw in Afghanistan. In 2021, the 1457th was sent to the US-Mexico border under the direction of US Northern Command. Approximately 50 members of the battalion were deployed to assist CBP by enhancing infrastructure and logistical capabilities to bolster border security efforts. Sergeant Smith described the successes of the mission despite such a short notice, as some of the soldiers around him said they preferred the living conditions of Afghanistan over the border. The 1457th continues to serve proudly to this very day, and their camaraderie is strong. As they train diligently, they remain uncertain of what lies ahead, but they stand trained and ready to answer their nation's call.
Man 2-3, man 2-2, over.
Every time it's the same, oh, I feel that it's real, take my heart.
Roger, be advised, Redcon 1 is 5 mics.
Oh, I can't